Grace Whittaker had always hated hospitals. It wasn't the antiseptic smell or the clinical lighting, though those didn't help. It was the way time seemed to stretch unnaturally within those walls. Minutes bloated into hours. Faces passed like ghosts. The clock above the exam room ticked at a pace she swore was slower than it should be, and today it had stopped altogether. Dr. Lynn sat across from her, fingers interlaced tightly. The silence hung thick in the room, as if the universe were holding its breath. Grace noticed the faint stain on the doctor's white coat, a coffee splotch near the hem. Somehow that small imperfection made her seem more human, and that made the words coming out of her mouth all the more terrifying. "I'm so sorry, Grace. The cancer has metastasized." 4 words. Grace felt them like a door slamming shut. She blinked. "But I was feeling better last week." Dr. Lynn nodded, her expression gentle but firm. "That's not uncommon. Sometimes there's a small window of relief, but the scans are very clear. The disease has spread to your liver and lungs." "How long?" Dr. Lynn hesitated for only a heartbeat, but it was enough to answer the question. 3 to 6 months, she said softly. "If treatment continues, without it, less." Grace didn't cry. Not then, not in front of the beige wallpaper and plastic chair and tissue box waiting like a cruel joke on the table beside her. She simply nodded, collected the folder of pamphlets she would never read, and walked out the door as if she still had somewhere to be. Outside, the September air was crisp, the kind that nipped at your cheeks and reminded you that summer was truly gone. She stood on the hospital steps for a long moment, watching cars pass and leaves swirl. The world didn't stop with her news, it just kept turning. She wasn't ready to tell anyone, not yet. Not her sister Lena, who called every Friday without fail. Not her neighbor George, who left casseroles at her door every Sunday like clockwork. And not her ex-husband Mark, who had once told her she was the strongest person he'd ever known. What a lie that felt like now. Back home, Grace sank into her favorite chair by the window. It faced the lake, a glimmering patch of water tucked beyond the edge of her small Massachusetts town. Most days, she barely noticed it. Today, it shimmered like something alive. She put the kettle on, out of habit more than desire. Rooibos tea, her favorite. She watched the steam rise in lazy curls and tried not to think about bucket lists or regrets. Still, her mind wandered. There were things she had wanted, places she had planned to visit, a letter to her father she never wrote, a book she never finished reading. And love, true, bone-deep, unshakable love that had never quite found her. She had been close once, with Mark, but that love had unraveled quietly, like a sweater thread tugged too many times. They had divorced amicably 5 years ago. No screaming, no betrayal, just a slow drifting apart, 2 people who had run out of shared dreams. Grace wrapped herself in the old knit throw draped over her chair and looked out at the lake again, and for the first time since the diagnosis, she whispered, "So what now?" The next morning, Grace did something uncharacteristic. She walked, not a brisk, purposeful march, like she used to do with her dog before he passed. This was a meander, a letting-go kind of walk. Down the trail that led to the lake, past wildflowers she couldn't name and trees beginning their shift to fiery reds and golds. The bench by the water was empty, until it wasn't. He was there. A stranger, sitting like he belonged, with a small notebook in hand and a thermos by his feet. Grace hesitated. The bench could fit 2, but she wasn't in the mood to talk. Still, something about him was quiet, not just in the way he sat, but in the way he existed, as if he understood how to leave space for other people to breathe. She sat. For a while, they said nothing. The breeze rippled the surface of the water. Ducks quacked in the distance. Eventually, he looked over and offered a small smile. "Morning." "Morning," she replied, cautious but polite. He tapped the notebook with his pen. "Do you ever write?" Grace frowned. "Write? Yeah. Poetry. Thoughts. Grocery lists even." She almost laughed. "Not since high school." He nodded. Like that made perfect sense. High school. That's when it still felt okay to be a mess on paper. She glanced at his notebook. "What are you writing?" He looked out over the lake. "Trying to remember something I dreamed. It keeps slipping away. I figured I'd chase it here." Grace tilted her head. "Dreaming by the lake, huh? That sounds poetic." His eyes twinkled. "Maybe a little." They fell into silence again, but this time it felt companionable. After 10 minutes, she rose to leave. "Grace," she said, surprising herself. He looked up. "My name." "It's Grace." He smiled, warm and sure. "Elias." She walked home with a strange feeling humming beneath her ribs. That night, Grace didn't cry, not even when she took her evening meds or caught her reflection in the mirror and saw how tired she looked. Instead, she thought of Elias and smiled. The next day, Grace returned to the lake. She told herself it was for the fresh air, for the feel of fall brushing against her cheeks, the leaves underfoot crunching like brittle memories. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the truth. She wanted to see him again. Elias, it had been years since she felt that kind of tug, the curious pull of another person's presence. She didn't even know his last name, and yet he lingered in her thoughts like a warm echo. The bench by the water was empty when she arrived. She stood for a long moment, almost embarrassed by her own disappointment. But she sat anyway. Hands folded in her lap, eyes scanning the lake. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe he was just a wandering poet passing through town. Or maybe yesterday had been one of those rare moments of unexpected beauty, meant to be experienced, not pursued. Still, she sat. 10 minutes, then 20. The wind picked up, scattering leaves across the path like confetti. She was just about to leave when, "There you are." She turned, and there he was, Elias. Same weathered leather jacket, same soft smile. "You thought I wouldn't come back," he said, settling beside her. "I thought you were a figment of my imagination." He laughed, a low, kind sound. "I get that a lot." She watched him pull out his notebook, flipping to a blank page. "What are you writing today?" she asked. "Nothing yet. I figured I'd let the lake speak first." She smirked. "That's very poetic." "I told you," he said, grinning. "I'm a dream chaser." Grace looked out over the water. "Dreams are funny things." "Yeah? They don't always survive in daylight." He turned slightly, studying her. "That sounds like something someone would say if they stopped dreaming a long time ago." Grace didn't reply immediately. A few ducks glided past on the surface of the lake, forming ripples that slowly fanned out toward the shore. "Maybe I have," she said finally. "Or maybe I just woke up one day and realized I didn't have time to waste on things that wouldn't last." Elias nodded thoughtfully, tapping his pen against his notebook. "Funny thing," he said, "I think dreams matter most when time is running out." The words landed heavier than he intended, and she flinched, barely perceptibly. He noticed. "Sorry," he said. "Didn't mean to." "It's okay." Her voice was soft. "You didn't know." A silence passed between them. Not awkward, but not quite comfortable either. He didn't ask. She didn't tell. But something shifted in that moment. An understanding neither could name. "Would you like some coffee?" Elias asked after a while, gesturing to the thermos by his feet. "It's not fancy, but it's hot." Grace hesitated, then nodded. "Sure." He poured it into the small tin cup and handed it to her. She took a sip. It was stronger than she expected, a little bitter but warming. "Better than hospital coffee," she muttered. "Hospital?" Elias raised an eyebrow. She waved a hand, brushing the comment aside. Nothing major. A lie. But she wasn't ready to hand him the truth yet. Not when she didn't even know what he was offering in return. They spent the next hour talking. Nothing deep, books they loved, childhood pets, strange dreams, favorite colors. Elias had a wry sense of humor and a quiet ease to him, the kind that made conversation feel like slipping into warm water. Grace surprised herself by laughing, not a polite chuckle, but a real laugh that left her breathless for a second. When the sun started to lower and the breeze picked up, she stood reluctantly. I should go. Elias stood too. Me too. Got to get back before my cat destroys what's left of my sanity. You have a cat? Unfortunately, she thinks I exist to open doors and apologize for being late with tuna. Grace smiled. What's her name? Louisa. Like Alcott? Exactly. She's a writer too, in her mind anyway. Grace laughed again. Maybe I'll meet her sometime. Elias tilted his head. Maybe you will. They parted ways, walking opposite directions down the trail. But Grace felt the weight of his presence still at her side, like a phantom warmth. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm. Each morning she would wake and take her pills. Each afternoon she would walk to the lake. Sometimes Elias was already there. Sometimes he arrived after. They shared coffee, stories, silences. He never pried, never asked the question she wasn't ready to answer. But she could see in his eyes that he sensed something, not wrong exactly, but delicate, like a string pulled too tight. One afternoon, she brought an old book of poems with her. Elias's eyes lit up when he saw it. Wendell Berry? He asked, flipping through the pages reverently. I used to teach him in high school lit class, she said, back before I retired. You were a teacher? 28 years. God, he said, whistling. That's like 100 in teacher years, she grinned. Tell me about it. They read a few lines aloud to each other, taking turns like old friends. One passage made her pause. What we fear most is not the end, but the unfinished. Elias looked at her, not sharply, not with pity, just a steady gaze. Is there something you haven't finished? He asked gently. Grace looked out at the water. Maybe, she said. Maybe I'm just starting something now. One day, the walk to the lake felt harder. Her breath was shallow by the time she reached the bench, and she had to sit down fast. Before her legs gave way, she hoped he wouldn't notice, but of course he did. You okay? He asked, crouching beside her. I'm fine, she said, forcing a smile, just a little winded. Elias didn't press. He simply sat beside her and opened his notebook again. This time, though, he didn't write. He just held it, flipping the pages with a distracted thumb. After a while, she spoke. I have cancer. Elias looked up, eyes calm. I know. Grace blinked. You... what? I figured, he said softly, the way you move, the way you sometimes wince when you think I'm not looking, and that one day you flinched when I said time was running out. Her throat tightened. Why didn't you say anything? Because it's not mine to name, he said, and I didn't want you to feel like it was the only thing about you worth knowing. She looked away, but not before he saw the glimmer in her eyes. You don't have to be alone in it, he added, voice low, not unless you choose to be. For a long time, they said nothing. The lake shimmered in the dying light. A pair of swans drifted past, necks curved toward each other like a secret shared. Grace reached out and took his hand, and in the silence that followed, something began. The next week felt like a blur to Grace. The moments she spent with Elias became her quiet anchor. She would wake each morning with the steady, familiar ache of knowing the world outside her little cottage was moving, but she had stopped rushing. Each day she took her time to dress, to sit at her kitchen table and drink tea, to listen to the wind as it swirled around the trees. It wasn't a perfect life, but for the first time in months she wasn't counting the days until the end. It was Elias who made her realize that time didn't have to feel like an enemy. He didn't talk about it much, not in any way that felt forced, but the way he existed, here, now, present, reminded her that there was more to be lived than just the ticking of a clock. One day, as autumn was beginning to lean toward its final stretch, she found herself once again walking toward the lake. Her breath caught in the crisp air as she saw Elias waiting for her by the bench, his back against the tree, a letter in his hand. "Another letter?" she asked, smiling as she approached. He looked up and nodded, his lips curving into the familiar grin she had come to adore. "Yeah, I've been getting some strange mail lately. Don't think it's from anyone I know." Grace took a seat beside him, eyeing the envelope in his hand. "Is it a love letter? Or perhaps a threat?" Elias chuckled, shaking his head. "Nothing that dramatic, but you'll find out in a minute." He handed the letter over and Grace took it, her fingers brushing against his for a second longer than necessary. There was something electric in the small, accidental touch, but she didn't pull away. The envelope was old, with yellowed paper, and a faint smell of lavender. The address was written in a delicate, swirling script she could barely make out. "Who's it from?" Grace asked, her voice soft with curiosity. "I don't know, that's the funny part." With a slight hesitation, Elias tore the seal and pulled out the folded paper. He unfolded it slowly, revealing a series of handwritten words that seemed to dance on the page. Grace leaned closer, reading over his shoulder. "To the woman who dreams beneath the stars, a story waits for you at the edge of the lake. Meet me there. Your friend, A." The letter was brief, almost cryptic. Grace glanced at Elias, who wore a puzzled expression, a flicker of something he couldn't quite name crossing his face. "Do you know anyone with the name A?" Grace asked. "Not a soul," Elias said, folding the letter in his hands. "It's almost like a riddle, but I'm not sure what it means." Grace stared at the letter for a moment, her mind running over possibilities. She had always been a lover of mysteries, of unanswered questions, but now it felt different. The letter didn't just speak of curiosity. It felt like a call, a challenge. "What do you think?" she asked softly. "Should we go find this A?" Elias's smile returned, but there was something new in his eyes, a spark of adventure. "Why not? At the very least, it'll make for a good story." Together they stood, Grace feeling the weight of the letter in her hands. Something was pulling her forward, a feeling that even the illness that clung to her like a shadow couldn't diminish. They walked side by side, the cool breeze curling around them like the past and future tangled together. The lake shimmered in the soft evening light, the colors reflecting off the surface like a dream just out of reach. Elias led the way, and Grace followed, her steps light but determined. It didn't take long for them to reach the spot where the trees parted to reveal a small clearing, the perfect place for a story to begin. Grace had come here so many times before, but tonight felt different. The air was charged with anticipation, as if the very earth beneath them was holding its breath. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, and Elias looked around, his gaze scanning the space. "It's a little eerie, don't you think?" Grace glanced around too. There was no sign of anyone, no shadow of a figure, no movement that suggested they weren't alone. But there was something in the stillness, a weight, a quiet hum that sent shivers down her spine. "Maybe we're not meant to find them right away," she said. Elias nodded, though he looked disappointed. "Could be, but then, just as they were about to turn back, there was a rustling sound from the trees ahead. A figure stepped into the clearing, tall and cloaked in shadows. Grace's breath caught in her throat. The figure paused, its outline barely visible in the fading light, but its presence unmistakable. It wasn't until they took a few steps closer that she could make out the details. The strong, slender build, the dark eyes gleaming in the dimness. And then the figure spoke. "You came. The voice was soft, smooth like honey, but somehow distant, as though the speaker were both here and somewhere far away. Grace felt her heart race, but she didn't take a step back. Instead, she stood tall, facing the mystery that had called her here. "I don't know who you are," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. "But I'm listening." The figure smiled, though it was almost hidden in the shadows. Slowly, deliberately, they pulled something from their pocket. Another letter. "This one's for you," they said, extending it toward Grace. Elias took a half step forward, his hand raised as if to stop her, but Grace wasn't afraid. There was something oddly familiar in the stranger's voice, in the way they moved, something that called to her like the pull of the lake's waves. She reached out and took the letter. It was heavier than she expected, thicker than the one before. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she looked back at the figure. "Who are you?" she asked again. The figure hesitated, then answered in the same cryptic tone. "I am someone who knew you long ago. A memory from a time you've forgotten." Grace's pulse quickened. She didn't understand, but there was something about the words that resonated with her, something that struck deep inside her chest, like a memory just beyond her reach. Without another word, the figure turned and began to walk away, fading into the trees. "Wait," Grace called, but they were already gone. She stood still for a long moment, the letter trembling in her hands. Elias was silent beside her, watching her closely. "Grace?" he asked softly. "What just happened?" She opened the letter, the words written inside simple but heavy. "Remember, the past is never as far away as you think. You'll understand soon enough." Grace's eyes widened, and she felt a strange knot twist in her stomach. "What is this?" she whispered. Elias placed a hand on her shoulder. "Are you okay?" But she wasn't sure. She wasn't sure of anything, anymore. The next few days felt like they belonged to someone else. Grace moved through them in a daze, unable to shake the feeling that something had shifted irrevocably inside her. The letter, the figure in the clearing, the strange words, they clung to her like a fog she couldn't escape. Elias hadn't spoken much about what had happened after the mysterious figure disappeared, but he had stayed close as he always did. They spent the following day together, walking the quiet trails near her home, though neither of them spoke of the encounter. It was as if the moment had existed in a different world, one that neither of them could fully comprehend. But every so often, Grace would glance at him, and he would meet her gaze, his expression filled with an unspoken understanding. He didn't need to ask if she was okay. He already knew she wasn't. It wasn't long before Grace decided she needed to return to the lake. It was the one place she felt she could breathe, where the quiet of nature could help her sort through the chaos inside her. But this time, she went alone. Elias had understood. He knew when to give her space. She walked to the edge of the water, the cool breeze teasing the edges of her hair. The lake was still, almost eerily so, as if holding its breath. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the wind against her skin, letting it soothe the anxious energy that had settled within her. For a long while, she stood there, waiting for something to happen, waiting for an answer, but the lake remained quiet, offering only the rustling of leaves in the trees and the faint chirping of birds in the distance. She could almost hear Elias's voice in her mind, reminding her that time was slipping away, that she shouldn't waste it on things that didn't make sense. But her heart couldn't let go of the mystery. It was a thread, delicate, yet strong, and it had wound its way into her soul. After some time, she sat down on a large flat stone, near the water's edge, her eyes drifting to the horizon. Suddenly, a sound broke the stillness, a rustle in the trees. A figure stepping through the underbrush, almost too quietly, too cautiously. Grace's heart skipped a beat. and she turned toward the sound. Standing in the shadow of a tall oak tree was the figure from before. It was as if they had been waiting for her, as if they had known she would come here, to this exact spot, on this exact day. The figure's face was still hidden in the darkness beneath their hood, but the same soft, almost hypnotic voice reached her ears. "You've returned." Grace stood, her pulse quickening. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What do you want from me?" The figure stepped closer, their movements deliberate, as if they were making sure not to startle her. "I want you to understand something," they said. "I want you to know that what is happening to you is not an accident." Grace frowned, confusion knitting her brow. "I don't understand. What do you mean?" The figure hesitated before stepping into the dim light, just enough for Grace to make out the sharp, angular features of their face. It was a face she had never seen before, yet something about it tugged at the corners of her memory, like an echo of a dream long forgotten. "I'm here because I'm part of something you've forgotten," the figure said, their voice steady but gentle. "Something that you need to remember before it's too late." Forgotten? Grace's mind was racing, trying to make sense of the words, trying to piece together a meaning that was slipping through her fingers like water. "Yes," the figure replied. "A long time ago you were part of something that would change everything. You were someone who could change everything. But you lost that connection. You've forgotten who you are." The words were heavy, with a weight she couldn't place. She wanted to ask more, to demand answers, but the figure raised a hand as if urging her to stay calm. "I know this is difficult to understand," they said, their voice softening, "but you must trust me. What is happening to you now? Your illness? It's not just a disease. It's a path, a part of the journey you've been on for much longer than you realize." Grace's heart began to race, her mind whirling with confusion. "What do you want me to do?" she whispered. "What can I do?" The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, they reached into their cloak and pulled out a small, weathered object. They held it out to her, their hand trembling slightly. As they did, Grace hesitated for a moment, but something inside her urged her to take it. She reached out and accepted the object from their hand. It was an old locket, tarnished with age. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the weight of it, the coolness of the metal. There was something familiar about it, something that tugged at her heart. The figure spoke again, their voice soft, almost sorrowful. "This is yours. It always has been." Grace's fingers trembled as she opened the locket. Inside there was a small, faded photograph. The image was blurry, but she could make out the soft, loving smile of a woman. And standing beside her, no, holding her, was a man, his face half turned away from the camera, but his eyes were unmistakable. Elias, her breath caught in her throat. It was him. But how? The figure's voice came again, as if reading her thoughts. "You and Elias, your connection goes deeper than you know. You're not just tied to him by chance. He's part of your story, part of your past, and that past is calling to you." Grace's head spun, the pieces of a puzzle she didn't understand beginning to fall into place. But it was too much to process, too much to grasp all at once. The figure took a step back, their gaze soft but urgent. "You must remember, Grace. You must remember before it's too late." Before she could ask more, the figure turned and began to walk away, melting back into the shadows of the trees. Grace stood there, the locket clutched tightly in her hand, staring after them. The weight of what had just happened settled into her chest, and for the first time in days, she felt a flicker of understanding, but it was still so far out of reach. So much of it didn't make sense, but she would figure it out. She had to. The days following her encounter with the mysterious figure felt surreal. Grace couldn't shake the image of Elias's face in the locket, his eyes as familiar as her own reflection. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that photograph, the soft, almost otherworldly connection between her and the man she had come to love in her final months. But nothing made sense. Elias had never mentioned anything about such a connection. They had met under ordinary circumstances, forged their bond in the simplest way, two souls finding comfort in each other's presence. Now that connection felt like a tether pulling her into a past she couldn't remember. The locket, however, was a constant reminder. She carried it with her everywhere, feeling its weight in her pocket, pressing it to her chest at night as if it could anchor her in a reality that was beginning to slip away. She needed answers. It was on the third day after the encounter that Grace decided to confront Elias. He was waiting for her at the little cafe they often visited. She noticed, as soon as she entered, that there was a tension in his shoulders, a wariness in his gaze. He had been distant these past few days, though they had exchanged smiles and pleasantries. Something was changing in the air, something they both felt but hadn't yet acknowledged. "Elias," she began softly as she sat across from him, her hands wrapped tightly around the locket, "there's something you need to tell me." His eyes flickered, and she knew then that he had been expecting this moment. He took a deep breath, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. "What's going on, Grace?" he asked, his voice steady, but there was an edge of concern beneath. You've been distant, and this locket," Grace's heart pounded. "It's mine, but it's not just the locket, Elias. There's more. She hesitated, unsure how to begin. "You were in that photograph, with me, long before we met." His gaze faltered, and for the first time she saw fear in his eyes. The kind of fear that made her breath catch in her throat. "Grace," he said quietly, his voice thick with something that sounded like regret. "I never wanted you to remember, but I knew you would. Eventually, you would remember." Her chest tightened. "Remember what? Who am I, Elias? What am I forgetting?" He reached across the table, taking her hand gently in his. "It's time you knew the truth," he said, his voice low and full of sorrow. "You're not who you think you are. We're not who we think we are." Grace's mind whirled, struggling to make sense of his words. "What do you mean? What do you mean we're not?" "The illness," he said, cutting her off. "It's not a disease. It's a curse. A curse that binds you to me and me to you." She shook her head, trying to hold on to her thoughts. "A curse? Not just any curse," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "You and I, our bond goes beyond this lifetime. It's been happening for centuries, Grace. I've been by your side again and again. Every lifetime we find each other. But each time it's the same." Her heart pounded in her chest, the words threatening to suffocate her. "The same? What do you mean? Why didn't you tell me?" "I couldn't," Elias whispered, his gaze filled with regret. "I didn't want to, because each time when you remember, you lose everything. You forget everything, everything we've built, every life we've lived. And when you remember, your time is up. You die." Grace recoiled, her grip tightening. "On the locket? What do you mean I die?" Elias's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "The illness is a cycle, Grace. You're dying because you're remembering. You're remembering the truth, and with that memory comes the end. This life is the last." Grace's world began to spin. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't process the weight of his words. Her hands trembled as she clutched the locket in a death grip, the vision of the photograph flashing before her eyes. "You're telling me I've lived this life before?" Her voice barely made it past a whisper. "Yes," he said, his voice breaking. "Over and over again. But this time we were supposed to be together. You were supposed to live." Her heart twisted. "But I'm dying. This time I'm really dying." Elias's face crumpled. "I don't want to lose you again, not like this." Grace could see the love in his eyes, a love that spanned lifetimes, a love that was older than time itself. But she also saw the truth, the inescapable truth. She had always been destined for this ending. The memories were a burden she couldn't escape, and now the clock was ticking. "I'm sorry," she whispered, feeling tears well in her eyes. "I never asked for any of this. I never asked for any of the pain, any of the loss." "I know," Elias whispered, his voice full of grief. Neither of us did. The silence between them stretched, and for a moment all Grace could hear was the pounding of her heart. Time, like a cruel trickster, seemed to stand still. "I remember," she said finally, her voice breaking. "I remember now, all of it, the love, the loss, the pain." Elias reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm so sorry, Grace. But this is the end. There's nothing we can do to stop it." Grace closed her eyes, feeling a warmth spread through her chest, an acceptance. There was no way to fight it, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't afraid to let go, not when she knew that whatever came next, whatever awaited her beyond this life, would be full of love. "I don't want to forget," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But maybe it's time to rest." Elias nodded, tears slipping down his face. "I will always love you, Grace, no matter where or when. I'll always find you." She smiled through her tears, squeezing his hand one last time. "I know." And with that, the world around them seemed to fade away. The pain, the sickness, the fears, all of it began to dissolve, leaving only peace.